In December of 2006, the world witnessed something remarkable. Hard Rock Incorporated, a global chain of restaurants, hotels, and casinos, was purchased for $965 million. The buyers? The Seminole Tribe of Florida. At the press conference, Max Osceola Jr., a tribal representative, declared with pride, "Our ancestors sold Manhattan for trinkets. Today, we began to buy it back, one hamburger at a time." That boldness was no accident. For centuries, the Seminoles had carried the reputation of being the only Native American tribe that never signed a peace treaty, never surrendered to the United States government, and never allowed their spirit to be broken. But who were these people? And how did they become legends of defiance? To understand, we must journey back to the 18th century, to the southeastern United States, in the lands of present-day Georgia and Alabama. There, the Muskogee Creek people lived, a powerful confederacy of towns and villages. But as white settlers pressed further into their world, cracks appeared. Some Creek leaders encouraged their people to take up European ways, raising cotton, buying African slaves, and building plantations. To others, this felt like betrayal. Seeking to preserve their traditions, many Creeks abandoned their old homeland and migrated south into Florida. They were joined by other displaced tribes and by African slaves who had escaped bondage. The Spanish who loosely ruled Florida at the time called these diverse newcomers Cimarron, wild ones, or runaways. In English, that word became Seminoles. By the mid-1700s, the Seminoles had forged their own identity. They built open-air homes called chickees above the swamp waters. Their hunters pursued deer and turkey, but also alligators. Their women cultivated corn, beans, and squash. And their villages became sanctuaries for black freedmen, who lived in their own communities, farmed, raised cattle, and fought alongside the Seminoles in war. Here, in the swamps of Florida, a new people had been born, fierce, independent, and bound together by a shared rejection of the world beyond their borders. The young Seminole nation did not remain unnoticed for long. Their swamps became a beacon of freedom, not only for native peoples fleeing turmoil, but also for enslaved Africans across the South. Runaways slipped through the night to Florida, finding refuge among the Seminoles. They built their own settlements, raised livestock, and fought shoulder to shoulder with their hosts. For the slaveholding South, this was intolerable. Every escaped family that disappeared into the swamps was a living act of rebellion. By the 1810s, tension between the United States and the Seminoles had reached its breaking point. In 1816, at Prospect Bluff, a group of black warriors and their families fortified an abandoned British outpost. They raised a red flag above the walls, declaring they would fight to the death rather than return to slavery. When the U.S. Army attacked, a single cannon shot ignited the fort's gunpowder magazine. In an instant, more than 300 defenders, men, women, and children, were killed in a fireball. The survivors struck back with fury, raiding American settlements along the Georgia border. Soon after, Seminole warriors ambushed a U.S. Navy boat, killing dozens. The message was clear: the Seminoles would not be broken. President James Monroe sent a rising military commander to crush them, Major General Andrew Jackson. With thousands of troops, Jackson burned villages, seized Spanish forts, and executed Seminole chiefs and even British traders who had supplied them with arms. By 1818, the Seminoles had been forced deeper into the wilderness. Spain, too weak to defend its claim over Florida, surrendered the territory to the United States in 1819. For the Seminoles, this meant disaster. The Americans now controlled the land, and peace would come only on the government's terms. In 1823, the Seminoles were coerced into signing the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. Their homeland was slashed to a fraction, a reservation in the swamps of central Florida. The government promised peace, but the Seminoles knew better. The fight was only beginning. By the 1830s, the United States had grown hungrier for land. President Andrew Jackson, the same man who once burned Seminole villages, now sat in the White House. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, decreeing that all Native Americans east of the Mississippi must be forced westward. For the Seminoles, the plan was especially insulting. They were to abandon Florida, the land they had bled for, and share a reservation in Arkansas with their old Creek enemies. To most Seminole leaders, this was unthinkable. In 1832, under pressure, a few chiefs signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing, agreeing to relocation. But the majority refused. U.S. officials claimed the treaty applied to everyone, and in 1834 delivered an ultimatum: leave Florida or be removed by force. One man in particular refused to bow. His name was Osceola. Born of mixed heritage, Creek mother, English father, he had risen as a fierce chieftain among the Seminoles. At first, he feigned cooperation with American agents, even befriending Wiley Thompson, the federal officer overseeing Seminole removal. Thompson once gave Osceola a rifle as a gesture of trust. That rifle would soon speak with vengeance. On December 28, 1835, Osceola ambushed Thompson outside Fort King, killing him with the very weapon he had been gifted. That same day, a column of 110 U.S. soldiers under Major Francis Dade was marching through the Florida wilderness. From the trees, Seminole warriors led by Chiefs Micanopy and Jumper unleashed a storm of musket fire. By the time it ended, only 2 soldiers survived. This was the beginning of the Second Seminole War, the bloodiest, costliest native conflict in U.S. history. Osceola and his warriors struck with guerrilla brilliance. They vanished into the swamps, launched sudden raids, and melted back into the mist. They never fought on open ground, where American firepower could crush them. Instead, they made Florida itself their greatest weapon, its rivers, jungles, and endless wetlands. For 7 years, the United States bled treasure and men into Florida's swamps. And for 7 years, the Seminoles endured, guided by a chieftain who refused to surrender. By 1836, the war had spread across Florida like wildfire. Seminole raiding parties struck plantations, isolated forts, and supply lines. Families fled their homesteads, while U.S. commanders grew increasingly frustrated. The swamps seemed alive with ghosts, warriors who appeared, attacked, and vanished again. But Osceola's brilliance also made him the prime target. The U.S. knew that to break Seminole resistance, they had to break him. Major General Thomas Jessup devised a ruthless plan. He invited Osceola to peace talks under a flag of truce, a sacred symbol that promised safety. Trusting the gesture, Osceola arrived at Fort Peyton with only a small escort. But the promise was a lie. Jessup's men seized him on the spot, violating every rule of honor. The capture sent shockwaves through the nation. Newspapers denounced it as cowardice. Even in Congress, voices rose to condemn Jessup's treachery, calling it one of the most disgraceful acts in American military history. Osceola was imprisoned at Fort Marion, then transferred to South Carolina. There, his health quickly collapsed. Stricken by fever and grief, he died in January 1838, a prisoner who had never surrendered. The U.S. Army buried him with full military honors, a strange gesture of respect for a man they had betrayed. Yet even with Osceola gone, the Seminoles fought on. Jessup, learning from his failures, shifted tactics. Instead of trying to lure warriors into open battle, he unleashed total war, burning villages, seizing cattle, and harassing women and children. His goal was not victory in combat, but starvation and exhaustion. Gradually, the relentless pressure took its toll. By 1837, hundreds of Seminole warriors had been captured or coerced into surrender. But still, small bands fought on, striking from hidden refuges like the Cove of the Withlacoochee, a swampy stronghold nearly impossible to penetrate. The war dragged into the early 1840s, costing the United States more than any other Indian conflict it had ever waged. And though thousands of Seminoles were forced west, a stubborn remnant remained, clinging to Florida's Everglades. The Seminoles had lost their greatest leader, but their defiance, like the swamps that sheltered them, endured. By the early 1840s, the United States declared the Second Seminole War over. More than 4,000 Seminoles had been captured and deported westward. Yet in the vast wilderness of southern Florida, about 300 remained. They had not surrendered, had not signed any treaty, and would not leave. For a time, the nation turned its gaze elsewhere. Florida became a U.S. state in 1845, and American settlers pushed deeper into the peninsula. The Seminoles, now fewer than ever, retreated into the Everglades, a maze of swamps, mangroves, and rivers that outsiders struggled to enter. But peace was fragile. In the 1850s, the federal government renewed its efforts to remove every last Seminole from Florida. Officials offered bribes, hundreds of dollars for each man and woman who agreed to relocate. Most refused. In 1855, U.S. surveyors destroyed Seminole crops near Fort Myers. For the tribe, this was the final insult. War ignited once more. This time, the Seminoles were led by Halputamiko, better known by his English name, Billy Bowlegs. He was proud, stubborn, and determined to resist, though his warriors numbered barely more than 100. With so few fighters, Bowlegs could not fight large battles. Instead, his men launched small raids, burning homesteads, ambushing patrols, and striking at fishermen and farmers along the coast. The U.S. military responded with overwhelming force. Brigadier General William S. Harney ordered the construction of fortified posts across Florida and sent patrols deep into the Everglades. Yet Bowlegs and his followers were like shadows. They melted into the swamps, leaving behind abandoned villages that soldiers could burn but never conquer. By 1858, the war had dragged on for 3 years, costing more than it was worth. The government turned again to negotiation, but this time with better terms. The Seminoles were promised not only money, but also a reservation of their own, separate from the hated Creeks. Weary of endless fighting, Bowlegs agreed. He and about 160 followers boarded ships westward. But not all left. Around 100 Seminoles refused, retreating even deeper into the Everglades. And there they remained, unconquered, unsurrendered, unseen. The United States, tired of chasing ghosts in the swamps, finally let them be. When the guns finally fell silent in 1858, the Seminoles had endured 3 wars across 4 decades. Thousands had been killed, captured, or forced westward to reservations in Oklahoma. Yet a small remnant remained in Florida, no more than 100 men, women, and children hidden deep in the Everglades. The U.S. government knew they were there, but after so much blood and treasure had been spent, Washington chose to look the other way. These last Seminoles had never signed a peace treaty, never surrendered, never accepted defeat. They simply endured, a living reminder that the United States had not won everything. Over the decades that followed, the Seminoles rebuilt. Those in Oklahoma grew into a thriving community, while the Florida Seminoles survived in the swamps until the 20th century, when they began to emerge and reclaim recognition. In 1957, the Seminole tribe of Florida was officially acknowledged by the U.S. government. From there, their story took a remarkable turn. Through determination and resilience, they transformed poverty into prosperity. They built successful businesses, invested in tourism, and eventually purchased one of the world's most iconic brands, Hard Rock International. The same people once hunted through swamps with muskets now owned hotels, casinos, and restaurants around the globe. Today, about 16,000 Seminoles live in Oklahoma and another 4,000 in Florida. They are entrepreneurs, leaders, and cultural guardians, living proof that survival is more than just endurance. It is an adaptation. The story of the Seminoles is one of fire and defiance. A people who fought the longest, bloodiest Indian wars in American history. A people who sheltered the oppressed, challenged the powerful, and refused to bow even when outnumbered 100 to 1. And above all, they are remembered as the tribe that never surrendered.